The Family Feud studio was filled with its customary warmth on a crisp November afternoon in 2024, the audience seated and ready for another episode of the beloved game show that had brought laughter and entertainment to American families for decades. Steve Harvey stood at center stage, his commanding presence radiating the humor and compassion that had made him one of television's most trusted hosts. The Harrison family from Boston prepared to compete against the Mitchell family from Atlanta, both teams displaying the excitement and anticipation that accompanied appearing on national television. Among the contestants stood Grace Harrison, a woman in her early 40s whose gentle smile and quiet demeanor suggested someone who had known both profound sorrow and remarkable resilience. What should have been a standard game show episode was about to become something far more meaningful when a simple introduction revealed a story of loss, courage, and the enduring power of love that would leave Steve Harvey and everyone watching profoundly moved and reminded of what truly matters in life. Before we continue with what happened next, if you value stories about the strength of the human spirit and the courage it takes to keep living and loving after devastating loss, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share the most powerful and inspiring moments from Family Feud that remind us about resilience, hope, and the bonds that transcend even death itself. Grace Harrison had lived through what many would consider an unbearable tragedy, yet she had somehow found the strength not only to survive but to continue building a life filled with purpose and love. 15 years earlier, Grace had been a young woman of 28. Happily married to her college sweetheart David Harrison for 3 years. They had been building their life together in a small apartment in Boston, both working demanding jobs while dreaming about starting a family and buying their first home. David had worked as a firefighter, a career he had chosen because of a deep commitment to service and protecting others. Grace had been a social worker specializing in foster care and adoption, helping children find permanent families and supporting foster parents through the challenges of caring for traumatized youth. Their lives had changed forever on September 11, 2001, when David had been among the first responders who rushed to help at the World Trade Center after the terrorist attacks. Grace had been at work when the towers were hit, watching the horror unfold on television like millions of others around the world. When she learned that David's unit had been dispatched to the scene, she had felt fear unlike anything she had experienced before, but she had also felt pride in the man she had married, the man who ran toward danger to save others while everyone else ran away. David had called her once from the site, his voice strained but steady as he told her that he loved her and that he was helping to evacuate people from the buildings. He had said that he had to go, that there were more people who needed help, and that he would see her soon. Those had been the last words Grace ever heard from her husband. David Harrison had been inside the North Tower when it collapsed, one of the 343 firefighters who gave their lives that day trying to save others. Grace had waited for days hoping for news that David had survived, that he had been found alive in the rubble, that somehow he would come home to her. But eventually the terrible truth had become undeniable. David was gone, killed in the collapse while doing the work he loved and saving lives in the process. At 28 years old, Grace had become a widow, her dreams of building a family with David shattered along with so much else on that September day. The months and years that followed had been the darkest period of Grace's life. She had struggled with overwhelming grief, with survivor's guilt about being alive when David and so many others were not, with anger at the senseless violence that had taken her husband from her. She had gone through the motions of daily life while feeling hollow inside, unable to imagine a future that did not include the man she had planned to spend her life with. She had attended countless memorial services and support groups for families of 9/11 victims, finding some comfort in shared grief, but also feeling that nothing could truly fill the void David's death had created. Slowly, with the support of family, friends, and professional counseling, Grace had begun to rebuild her life. She had returned to her work as a social worker, finding that helping children and families gave her a sense of purpose even when her own life felt purposeless. She had honored David's memory by living in ways that reflected the values he had embodied, including service to others and courage in the face of difficulty. She had allowed herself to grieve fully while also allowing herself to gradually rediscover moments of joy and connection. Several years after David's death, Grace had made a decision that she knew would be both difficult and meaningful. She had decided to become a foster parent, opening her home to children who needed temporary care while their families worked through crisis or while permanent adoptive homes were found for them. The decision had felt like a way to honor David's legacy of helping others and to create family connections even though she and David had not been able to have children together. Over the following years, Grace had fostered more than 30 children, providing them with safety, stability, and love during some of the most difficult periods of their young lives. Some had stayed with her for just a few weeks, while others had been with her for months or even years. She had celebrated their successes and supported them through their struggles. She had maintained relationships with many of them even after they moved on to reunification with their birth families or to adoptive placements, becoming a permanent positive presence in their lives. 8 years after David's death, Grace had met Robert, a fellow social worker who had also experienced the loss of a spouse to cancer several years earlier. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared understanding of grief and loss, mutual respect, and a recognition that loving again after profound loss was not a betrayal of those they had lost, but rather a testament to the capacity of the human heart to heal and expand. They had married 5 years ago, blending their experiences and their commitment to service into a partnership that honored their pasts while embracing their present and future together. Grace and Robert had continued their foster care work together, and 3 years ago they had made the decision to adopt 3 siblings who had been in the foster care system for years and who needed a permanent family. The children, now aged 12, 10, and 8, had come to them with significant trauma from abuse and neglect in their birth home, but Grace and Robert had provided them with the consistency, therapy, and unconditional love they needed to begin healing. The family had grown closer and stronger, creating new traditions and building trust. Grace's extended family, including her parents, her younger sister Emma, and her brother James, had been essential sources of support throughout her journey of loss and rebuilding. They had been there during the darkest days after David's death, had celebrated with her when she met Robert, and had embraced the foster and adopted children as beloved family members. When the opportunity arose to appear on Family Feud as a family team, Emma had suggested it as a way to create positive memories together and to do something fun that might win money to help with the children's college funds. Grace had agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to show her children that life could include joy and laughter even after hardship, and that family came in many forms and was built through love and commitment rather than just biology. On the morning of the taping, Grace had felt unusually emotional. The date was November 3rd, just weeks after the anniversary of David's death, a time of year when her grief always felt closer to the surface even after all these years. She had visited David's memorial that morning before heading to the studio, a ritual she maintained every year on the anniversary. She had told him about the life she had built, about Robert and the children, about how she tried to live in ways that would make him proud. She had cried, but had also felt grateful for the love they had shared and for the strength his memory continued to give her. The game had proceeded through the initial rounds with the Harrison family performing well and enjoying the experience. Steve Harvey had engaged with them warmly, making jokes and creating the light-hearted atmosphere that made Family Feud entertaining. Between rounds, Steve had done what he often did, asking family members to introduce themselves and share a bit about their lives. When it came to Grace's turn, Steve had asked his standard friendly question about what she did for work and about her family. Grace had smiled and begun to speak, her voice steady but soft. "I am a social worker and a foster and adoptive parent. My husband Robert and I have 3 adopted children, and we continue to do foster care for children who need temporary homes." Steve had responded with warm approval. "That is beautiful. That is real service, opening your home and your hearts to children who need families. How long have you been doing that work?" Grace had paused for a moment, And then she had made a decision to share more of her story than she had initially planned. I have been doing foster care for about 12 years. I started doing it several years after my first husband David was killed on September 11th. He was a firefighter who died in the North Tower collapse. The studio had fallen completely silent. The shift from the light-hearted game show atmosphere to this profound revelation had been immediate and total. Steve Harvey's expression had changed from his usual warm humor to something deeper, his eyes filling with emotion as he processed what Grace had just shared. Grace had continued speaking, her voice carrying both sorrow and strength. David and I had talked about having children and building a family together. After he died, it took me a long time to figure out how to keep living. Eventually I realized that the best way to honor his memory was to help others the way he had helped others. Fostering and now adopting children feels like continuing the work of service and love that David believed in. Her voice had wavered slightly, but she had maintained her composure as she finished. I have been blessed to find love again with Robert, and together we are building the family that David and I dreamed about. I know he would be happy about the life we have created. Steve Harvey had stood completely still, visibly struggling with his emotions. His eyes were wet with tears that he was not trying to hide. For several long moments, he did not speak, simply taking in what Grace had shared and processing the weight of her story. The audience sat in respectful silence, many people wiping away their own tears. When Steve finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, and he had to pause several times to compose himself. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I need a moment." He turned away from the contestants, walking a few steps toward the back of the stage and placing his hand over his face. The cameras captured him taking deep breaths, clearly overwhelmed by the depth of Grace's story and the resilience she represented. After perhaps 30 seconds, Steve turned back to face Grace. His usual composure had been replaced by raw emotion, but there was also profound respect and admiration in his expression. "Grace, I have been doing this show for many years. I have heard thousands of stories from thousands of families. But what you just shared, the loss you experienced, and the way you chose to respond to that loss by loving more people and helping more people, that is one of the most powerful things I have ever heard." He walked closer to Grace, his voice steady now but still emotional. "Your husband David was a hero. He gave his life trying to save others on one of the darkest days in our nation's history. But you, ma'am, you are also a hero. You took that unbearable loss and you turned it into service. You took your broken heart and you used it to love children who needed love. That takes a kind of courage and strength that most people cannot even imagine." Steve turned to address the audience and the cameras, wanting to honor not just Grace's story, but the broader context of loss and service that it represented. September 11th took thousands of lives and left thousands of families shattered. The first responders who died that day, the firefighters and police officers and paramedics who ran toward danger, they are heroes that we will never forget. But the families they left behind, the spouses and children and parents who had to figure out how to keep living after that loss, they are heroes too. Grace had tears streaming down her face now, moved by Steve's words and by the recognition of her journey. Her family members stood beside her, also crying, their arms around each other in support and shared emotion. Steve continued, his voice filled with conviction. "Ma'am, what you have done with your life since losing David is a testament to the power of love and the resilience of the human spirit. You could have let that loss destroy you. You could have closed your heart and refused to love again because it hurt too much. But instead you chose to honor David by living the values he represented. You chose to help children who needed families. You chose to love again. That is extraordinary." He paused, collecting himself once more before speaking directly to Grace. "I know David would be so proud of you. I know he would be proud of the foster children you helped and the children you adopted. I know he would be grateful that you found Robert and that you built a family that reflects love and service. You have taken tragedy and created beauty. That is what heroes do." The audience had risen to their feet in a standing ovation, expressing their admiration and respect for Grace and her journey. Many people in the studio were crying openly, moved by her story and by Steve's heartfelt response. Grace stood quietly, accepting the recognition with grace and humility, her hand held by Robert on one side and her sister on the other. Steve had to take another moment to compose himself before he could continue with the show. He wiped his eyes and took several deep breaths, clearly affected in a way that went beyond his typical emotional responses to contestant stories. He spoke to the production crew. "Give me just a minute. I need to get myself together. This is..." He paused, struggling to articulate the depth of what he was feeling. This is one of those moments that reminds you what really matters in life. This is bigger than the game show. The audience waited patiently, understanding that what they were witnessing was a genuine human moment of connection and emotion. After taking the time he needed, Steve returned to his position and addressed Grace one more time. "Mom, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for your service to those children. Thank you for honoring your husband's memory by living a life of courage and love. And thank you for reminding all of us what resilience looks like." With visible effort, Steve transitioned back into his role as game show host, though the emotional weight of Grace's story continued to influence the atmosphere throughout the rest of the taping. The questions and answers continued, but there was an underlying current of meaning and depth that had not been present before Grace shared her story. When the Harrison family eventually won the game and advanced to fast money, Steve made a point of rooting for them with particular enthusiasm, clearly hoping they would win the grand prize that would help with their children's education. The aftermath of that November day brought unexpected attention and support to Grace and her family. While the episode had not been intended as a tribute or a special feature, Grace's spontaneous sharing of her story had created one of the most emotionally powerful moments in Family Feud history. The show's producers worked with Grace to ensure she was comfortable with how the segment was edited and presented, giving her control over how much of her story was shared with the viewing audience. When the episode aired several weeks later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The clip of Steve Harvey taking a moment to recover after hearing Grace's story went viral within hours. Millions of people watched and shared the video, moved by Grace's resilience, by Steve's genuine emotional response, and by the reminder of the ongoing impact of September 11th on the families of those who died. Grace received thousands of messages from people around the world expressing support, gratitude for her service to foster children, and admiration for her courage in rebuilding her life after devastating loss. Many messages came from other 911 widows and family members who felt seen and honored by Grace's story being shared so respectfully on a mainstream platform. Foster and adoptive parents reached out to thank Grace for representing their community and for showing what love and commitment to vulnerable children looked like. First responders and their families expressed appreciation for the way Grace had honored her late husband's service, while also acknowledging the difficulty of being the family left behind. 3 months after that November day, Grace agreed to participate in a longer conversation on Steve Harvey's talk show about loss, resilience, foster care, and finding meaning after tragedy. She appeared with Robert and their 3 adopted children, all of whom had agreed that they wanted to be part of sharing their family's story. The children, who had been briefed about what would be discussed and had participated in deciding how much to share about their own experiences, spoke movingly about what it meant to be part of Grace and Robert's family and how they had learned about love, service, and resilience from their adoptive parents. When Steve asked Grace to share more about the years immediately after David's death and how she had moved through that grief to where she was today, Grace's response reflected the wisdom gained through profound suffering and intentional healing. She explained that there had been no shortcut through the grief, that she had needed to feel the full weight of her loss and to honor that pain rather than trying to rush past it. She described the support systems that had been essential to her survival, including therapy, support groups for 911 families, her faith community, and her biological family, who had refused to let her isolate herself, even when that was what she wanted to do. Grace spoke about the decision to become a foster parent as a turning point in her healing journey. She explained that caring for children who needed temporary homes had given her a purpose beyond her own grief and had allowed her to create family connections Even when she thought that possibility had died with David, she acknowledged that foster care had been difficult and had required her to be vulnerable and to love children, knowing that most of them would eventually leave to return to their birth families or move to adoptive homes. However, she had found that the risk of heartbreak was worth the opportunity to make a difference in children's lives and to experience the joy of loving and being loved by them even temporarily. When asked about meeting Robert and deciding to remarry, Grace spoke with honesty about the complexity of loving again after loss. She explained that she had initially felt guilty about developing feelings for Robert, as though loving someone new meant being disloyal to David's memory. Through therapy and conversations with other widows who had remarried, she had come to understand that the heart's capacity for love was not finite and that honoring David's memory did not require her to remain alone for the rest of her life. She emphasized that Robert had never tried to replace David or compete with his memory, but had instead honored what David had meant to Grace while also offering his own love and partnership. Grace also addressed the decision to adopt the 3 siblings who were now their children. She described meeting them when they first entered foster care, recognizing immediately that they were deeply wounded by their early experiences, but also resilient and deserving of a permanent family. She and Robert had worked closely with therapists and trauma specialists to learn how to parent children with complex needs, had committed to years of therapy and patience as the children learned to trust and attach, and had eventually made the decision to adopt them and make the placement permanent. She spoke about the challenges including behavioral issues, attachment difficulties, and the ongoing work of helping traumatized children heal, but also about the profound rewards of watching them grow and thrive in an environment of safety and consistency. Steve asked Grace what she would want to say to others who had experienced profound loss and were trying to figure out how to keep living in the aftermath. Grace looked directly at the camera and spoke from her heart and her experience. She acknowledged that every person's grief journey was unique and that there was no single right way to move through loss. However, she shared several principles that had guided her own healing. She emphasized the importance of allowing yourself to feel the grief fully rather than trying to suppress or avoid it, of seeking professional help when needed rather than trying to carry the burden alone, of finding meaning and purpose even when life felt meaningless, and of remaining open to love and connection, even though opening your heart again meant risking future pain. Grace also spoke directly to other 911 families and to families of first responders who had lost loved ones in the line of duty. She acknowledged the particular complexity of grief that came with losing someone who died serving others, the mixture of pride and anger and profound sadness that characterized that experience. She emphasized that it was acceptable to feel angry about the loss, even while honoring the service, that grief did not follow a timeline and could resurface even decades later, and that the families left behind were not forgotten and their ongoing struggles mattered. The expert guests on the show, including a grief counselor and a specialist in foster care and adoption, provided additional context and resources. The grief counselor discussed the concept of continuing bonds, the idea that relationships with deceased loved ones continue in changed form rather than ending at death, and how maintaining connection to the memory and values of lost loved ones could be part of healthy grieving. The foster care specialist talked about the critical need for more foster and adoptive families like Grace and Robert, who were willing to provide homes for children with complex trauma histories, and provided information about how people could get involved in foster care or support foster families in their communities. The response to Grace's extended interview was again overwhelmingly positive and meaningful. Foster care agencies reported significant increases in inquiries from people interested in becoming foster parents after seeing Grace's story and being inspired by her example. Support groups for 911 families and for widows and widowers more broadly reported increased participation from people who had been struggling alone but felt encouraged to seek community after seeing Grace speak openly about her journey. Schools and community organizations requested permission to use clips from the interview in discussions about resilience, service, and finding meaning after tragedy, 1 year after that November day at Family Feud, Grace and her family had continued building their life of service and love. The money they had won on the show had been placed in college savings accounts for their 3 children, providing educational opportunities that would have been difficult to afford otherwise. Grace and Robert had continued their foster care work, providing temporary homes for several more children throughout the year and maintaining relationships with former foster children who still considered them important figures in their lives. Their 3 adopted children had continued to thrive, making progress in therapy and in school and developing stronger attachments to Grace, Robert, and their extended family. Grace had also become more involved in advocacy work, speaking at events about foster care, adoption, and grief, using her platform to raise awareness and encourage others to consider how they might serve vulnerable populations in their communities. She had connected with other 9/11 widows and had become a mentor to newly bereaved spouses of first responders, offering them the understanding and support that could only come from someone who had walked that path herself. Steve Harvey remained in contact with Grace and her family, checking in periodically and celebrating their milestones. He spoke frequently in interviews about that November day and about how Grace's story had affected him personally and professionally. He described it as one of the most meaningful moments in his decades of television work, a reminder that entertainment could intersect with real human experience in ways that were profound and important. He emphasized that taking the time to truly hear Grace's story and to honor it with appropriate emotion rather than rushing past it to get back to the game had been one of the most important decisions he had made as a host. The legacy of that day at Family Feud extended far beyond Grace's individual story. The moment became a reference point in discussions about resilience after loss, about the ongoing impact of September 11th on American families, and about the importance of foster care and adoption. It was shared in grief support groups, shown in foster parent training programs, and referenced in courses about trauma and healing. It served as a reminder that ordinary people who survived extraordinary losses and chose to rebuild their lives with courage and service were heroes deserving of recognition and respect. At its core, the story remained a testament to several profound truths about human experience. Loss and grief were universal experiences that touched every life, and the pain of losing someone beloved was real and lasting. However, grief did not have to be the end of the story. People could survive devastating loss and eventually build lives that included joy, love, purpose, and meaning. Honoring the memory of those who died did not require remaining frozen in grief, but rather could be expressed through living in ways that reflected their values and continuing their legacy of service and love. Family could be created through commitment and love rather than just biology, and opening your heart to love again, whether through new romantic partnership or through caring for children who needed families, was not betrayal but rather courageous affirmation of life. Before we conclude this deeply moving story, if you believe that resilience in the face of loss is one of the most powerful expressions of the human spirit, and that service to others is a meaningful way to honor those we have lost, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share stories that inspire us to keep going even when life is difficult and that remind us of the love and courage that exist in ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Years after that November day, Grace continued to reflect on the unexpected impact of sharing her story on Family Feud. She acknowledged that it had been a spontaneous decision influenced by the emotional time of year and by Steve Harvey's genuine warmth that had made her feel safe sharing something so personal. She recognized that the public nature of her story had brought both opportunities for service and advocacy, but also moments of feeling exposed or of having her grief become public property in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable. However, she remained grateful for the platform to honor David's memory, to raise awareness about foster care and adoption, and to encourage other people who had experienced loss that rebuilding life was possible. She often said that if her story helped even one person feel less alone in their grief, or inspired one family to open their home to a child who needed care, then the vulnerability of sharing publicly had been worthwhile. The story of what happened when Steve Harvey took a moment to recover after a contestant shared a heart-wrenching story became a powerful example of authentic human connection, transcending the typically lighthearted atmosphere of game show television. It demonstrated that sometimes the most important moments were not the planned or scripted ones, but rather the spontaneous revelations of real human experience that reminded everyone of shared vulnerability, loss, resilience, and hope. It showed that taking time to truly honor someone's story, rather than rushing past it to return to entertainment, was a form of respect that mattered deeply. Grace's journey from devastated young widow to resilient foster and adoptive mother building a family and a life of service served as an inspiration and a reminder that the human capacity for healing, for continuing to love after loss, and for finding meaning through serving others was remarkable and deserving of recognition. Her message remained consistent over the years, which was that grief was a necessary and ongoing process that did not follow a timeline, that loving again after loss was possible and was not disloyal to those who died, that service to others could provide purpose and healing, and that ordinary people who kept living and loving after devastating loss were heroes whose courage and resilience should be honored and celebrated. That is the true story of what happened when a Family Feud contestant shared the story of losing her firefighter husband on September 11th and choosing to honor his memory through foster care and adoption, leaving Steve Harvey so moved that he had to take a moment to recover, reminding everyone watching that behind the games and the laughter were real people with real stories of loss and love and courage that deserved to be heard and honored with the full weight of emotion they carried, and demonstrating that sometimes the most important thing entertainment can do is step aside and make space for authentic human experience that connects us all through our shared experiences of loving, losing, and finding the strength to keep going.